Hello, my name is John M. Quick. I went on a quest so we could find out what are the best evidence-based ways to tell stories that inspire, influence, and transform our audiences. This journey took me through the research in neuroscience, literature, psychology, and learning, among other areas, to find the best principles that we can apply to our everyday professions and improve the stories that we tell, better engage people, and empower them to take our inspiration forward into their lives. Humans have been telling stories for longer than we've had the ability to write down the whole history of what we've been doing. Some would even say that storytelling is the fundamental thing that makes us human beings as compared to all of those other variety of living things that inhabit our universe. There are three fundamental elements to every story. There's a setting where the story takes place. There's one or more characters who have some kind of goal to pursue. Then there's events that either help or hinder the characters in making progress towards their goal. Every story has it. Setting, characters, events. I was at a conference in Exeter, England. One night after everything was done, I went out with a huge group of researchers to have dinner. There we sat at the long table in the restaurant. The server came around to take our drink orders. When she got to me, I asked what they had, heard the list. Lemonade was one of the choices. That sounds like a fine choice to me. I'll have lemonade, please. A few minutes later, the server comes back and sets down before me a clear carbonated liquid in a glass, which I'm fairly certain isn't lemonade. I turned to the researcher next to me, who's a native British, and I said, I ordered lemonade, but it looks like they gave me Sprite. Ha ha ha, oh, he says. Oh, that's funny. Lemonade's rare here. If you wanted lemonade, you had to ask for real lemonade. Otherwise, they'll just give you Sprite, because that's the common drink. We just call it lemonade. Well, this is a fascinating turn of events. So I say back, well, if lemonade is Sprite and real lemonade is lemonade, what do I order if I want Sprite? There's an example of a story for you. Setting, Exeter, England, at the restaurant. Character, myself. Goal, lemonade. Events, an attempt to order lemonade only to receive something that I did not think was lemonade. And talking to my counterpart, another event. A lesson, a harsh lesson learned. The principle of simulated experience states that stories stimulate our brains in the same way as lived experiences. What that means is they engage our senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, sound. When we say words like "the feather tickled the bottom of my toes," or "the siren blared in my ears," or "the frosty mountain tops, I could see my breath." When we say things like this, vivid descriptions and imagery, we are engaging the brain. We're taking people there as if they are there themselves. That means when you tell a story to your audience or to your colleagues, you are taking them into another world. About a month after I met my future wife, we planned a full day of dates. We call it the day of 4 dates, because we got up early in the morning, like 6 a.m., drove out to have a photo hunt at a national park. Then, all the way at night, we were going to go to a dance show. Late in the evening, before driving home, we had all these things planned for the entire day. At one point in the afternoon, we needed a little break, and we actually left ourselves a tiny gap of an hour or two. I said, "Hey, I know of an apartment we can stay at. It's my parents. They only use it occasionally during the week. It's the weekend. They won't be there. We'll go and relax for a little bit before our next thing on the schedule." I said, "Don't worry. They definitely won't be there." We get to the door. I've got the key in the door. I think I heard a noise on the other side. But I'm at the door now. We can't leave now. There could be someone on there. Sure enough, I open the door, and there's my parents. At this point, my wife seizes up in a full rigor mortis, becomes incommunicative, and doesn't move. What else can I do? But I pick her up, walk into the door, prop her up against the wall, and let her remain there, where she'll stay as I chat with my parents until it's time for us to leave. What's going on in this story? Well, I use a little bit of exaggerated imagery to describe how my wife tensed up so much that even I would have to pick her up stiff as a board, carry her into the room, just prop her up into the wall. So I used a little bit of expressive imagery there to convey not literally what happened to her, not a rigor mortis, but the way she felt. Her nerves, her surprise at having to meet my parents, after we've only known each other about 1 month, and I told her they wouldn't be home. So in that way, you see that it's a more powerful way. So I could have just said, she was very nervous. She came in, we sat down. I talked to my parents. She didn't say much because she was nervous. See, that's not as powerful as playing into a little bit of the vivid senses and imagery to make it more expressive. The principle of simulated empathy states that stories help us simulate social experiences with others. What that means is that when you tell a story that involves characters, whether they're real or fictional, whether you're in it or you're telling about somebody else, people project themselves into that social context. And they think about what are the characters thinking, what are their actions, what are their attitudes and beliefs. Automatically, when people hear a story about people interacting, they are analyzing the social context, just like we do when we have a regular conversation with people in the real world. Buddha's bald head bopped up and down as he entered the city gates. Over his shoulder, he carried a cloth sack that contained all of his worldly possessions. As he approached the city center, he gazed up at what once was a majestic fountain. Today, it was left in disrepair. The statue in the center had lost its arms. The foundation was cracking and crumbling. Buddha dropped his sack to the ground, and a small ball rolled out into the street. When he got done gazing at the fountain, he turned around to see a little boy peeking out from the corner of a building. The boy slowly approached with his eye on the ball. As he got within an arm's reach, he put his hand out and peeked at the Buddha. The Buddha smiled. The boy grabbed the ball. The Buddha laughed. The boy became at ease. Suddenly he took the ball and launched it into the fountain. It hit the statue in the middle and it crumbled down. The boy was scared to death. Buddha looked back at the boy and he laughed again. The boy relaxed a bit again. Squat down, he ran and he jumped into the fountain to get the ball back. Buddha turned around again. Now many more children had appeared. They ran and grabbed toys and candies and other objects out of his bag. Each time one came and grabbed it, he laughed again. The children giggled back. One by one, they jumped in the fountain and they all began to play. A few minutes later, an adult huffed and puffed and came up, red-faced, and demanded that Buddha tell him, what is going on here? What is all this ruckus in the center of my town? What are you doing to these children? Buddha turned to the man and replied, years ago I visited this city, and the fountain was a beautiful, majestic piece in the center of town. Today when I visited, I found it in complete disrepair. I only wanted to help give new life to this fountain, which has been neglected for so many years. After he said that, the man looked down. Buddha reached down and gave him a piece of candy and laughed and laughed. The man understood Buddha's point now and jumped into the fountain himself. A short while later, all the townspeople were live and playing in the fountain together, joyous and free. Buddha picked up his sack, what was left of it anyway, threw it over his shoulder, and slowly walked out of the city gates. That's the story of Buddha fixing the fountain, an original story that I wrote. As you can see, there's a lot of symbolism there. And there's also a lot of values and a lot of potential conflict to be interpreted. This is a story I might tell if I was going to discuss something like leadership or values. Why? Because the Buddha has a certain approach that's very unique and interesting in the situation. He saw a dead fountain and wanted to come up with a creative way to give it new life. Not only that, he handled certain interactions with the children and with the adults in certain ways. So there are many different meanings depending on the context that we could potentially give here. But if I just told you something like, solve out-of-the-box problems, that's not going to be very effective. If I tell you a story about the Buddha and let you reflect on it, let you discuss it with others, now we might be getting into a deeper context here, a social context that was represented through the story, which is a better way of conveying the message. The principle of authentic representation states that stories simulate authentic human experiences while varying widely in terms of their superficial characteristics. We've heard stories of all kinds. Some have aliens in them and they're set thousands of years in the future. Some have dragons in them and they're set in fantasy worlds 1,000 years in the past. Some are stories from the American Revolution or from caveman times, or even from our own modern urban cities. The thing is, a lot of these characteristics of setting are superficial. They help build out the context for a specific instance of a story. But there's a common thread through all of these that's underlying the story. That's the authentic human experience. One time-tested formula that you've probably heard about before is the hero's journey. This is a certain pattern of a story arc that goes through multiple phases. Basically that a hero is in the everyday world, gets called out into a grand adventure, goes through many trials, eventually ends up succeeding, and returns back to that original world, improved and bringing some kind of gift. Here's a couple examples of where we see this same story arc, or the concept of a hero, being applied through different superficial characteristics. In Lord of the Rings, we have a fantasy world that's set in the medieval past. In Harry Potter, we also have a fantasy world, but it's set in the modern world. It's more of an urban style, and it could be happening today where people have magical abilities. Then look at something like Star Wars. That one's set way out in the future where everybody's in space and they're shooting each other with lasers and there's all kinds of different aliens and other creatures. But no matter what, whether it's Luke Skywalker or Frodo Baggins or Harry Potter, they're all going through an authentic experience of being a regular person and then being called in to transform themselves and become a hero to the world. The authentic experience remains the same, but the superficial characteristics are all over the place. One night I was sitting in a canteen in Penang, Malaysia. I was sweating from the stifling heat, and on top of that I was eating spicy soup and crispy fried duck. At one point in the meal, the server came by and asked if I wanted some biscuits to go along with it. I said, biscuits, what a fine idea. I'd love to have some biscuits to go with this meal. The time went on and on. I ended up finishing my whole meal, wondering why didn't those biscuits ever come? Finally, some 20 minutes later, my server returns and puts down a plate of cookies in front of me. I said, well, this is an interesting turn of events. Now I have cookies, no biscuits. So I turned to the guy next to me at the table adjacent, who's a local. I said, hey, looks like said he was going to bring me biscuits, but now I've got a plate of cookies. The guy said, sir, I'm afraid you're mistaken. These are biscuits. What happened here? Well, biscuits is a word for cookies in Malaysia. So clearly I was the one who was mistaken, not my server. I was thinking of the fluffy white bread things that we have over in the States. Well, once again, I had the experience of ordering something that I thought was one thing and only to find out that it was another. Do you remember a story I told before about ordering lemonade in England? Getting soda and only to find out that if I wanted lemonade, I had to order something else. Interestingly enough, whether I set the story in England, ordering lemonade, or I set the story in Malaysia, ordering biscuits, I've represented the same authentic experience with different superficial characteristics. It's the same exact experience. I was a foreigner in a different place, trying to ask for something and not knowing the proper way to do it. You can do the same thing with your stories. What matters is to identify that common thread of experience that goes through it. The other details, they don't matter that much. In fact, that's why a lot of storytellers sometimes exaggerate or embellish or make things a little bit more interesting when they tell them. Use good descriptions. Remove characters that aren't totally necessary. Add a little bit of interesting dialogue or an interesting character with some comic relief. Whatever it is, find the best way to share that experience with your audience. The principle of narrative learning states that stories support learning by helping people make sense out of their personal experiences. By and large, humans try to make logical sense out of their world. That means if we come into a new experience or if we encounter new information, we want to know, how does it plausibly fit in to what I already know? Does it make sense to me? Or how can I make sense out of this new thing? And as we do this, you can think of it as a form of learning. We've got new information, we've got what we already know, we're rolling it all together to make sense of it so we have a better understanding of our world. You could say that we construct our own identities through stories, that we have a running dialogue in our heads, in our hearts, about how our whole life has been lived. When we confront some new experience, we're interpreting it in the context of what we've already known and done. This can help you in a motivational context. Think about people who might say, "Oh, I'm not smart enough for this," or "This is too hard for me," or "You have to have some special ability to do this." This is a good time when you might tell a story of someone like them who succeeded. That can help them realize that, oh, maybe I can do this. Maybe this can be a part of my story. It was the first day of class of computer programming. I was working with some very nervous, very anxious design students who had no programming background. Now, they had heard from the other students in years before about this programming class, about how hard it would be, how irrelevant all this stuff was, how there's no way to pass all the tests, you're definitely going to fail. They were telling themselves this in their own personal stories before we even walked in the door. Talk about being in a self-defeating situation. I knew I had to do something differently from the way things had been done in the past when I was going to teach the course. Here's what I did. First day of class, I had made a video game, a whole game that would help us learn that semester how to program a video game. First thing I did was throw it up on the screen and started playing through the game. This was to show them what they would be able to do by the end of the semester. Make an entire game that had the cool graphics, all the controls in there, nice fun gameplay. Not only that, I encouraged them to name the main character of the game. They chose Luna. And I explained, here's day one. Today we're going to get Luna to move. Look, she's stuck there on the screen. And you can press the buttons, but she's not going to do anything until you can program her to make it happen. Well, on one day, they got her to move. On another day, they added some friends. On another day, they added dungeons. And by the time we were done with the 15 weeks, they were able to do this. And more importantly, they had written their stories in their heads in a different way. I can succeed. I can pass this programming class. I love making video games. You can use stories to help people reframe their mindset and rewrite the personal stories that they're telling themselves in their head. The principle of balanced believability states that while stories that use common literal formats are more believable, stories that make use of literary devices like metaphors, analogies, and idioms are more engaging. Now we have a little bit of a conundrum that every storyteller has to face. It may be more straightforward to say it was 100 degrees outside than to say it was so hot that I saw the steam lines waving off the road and felt the sweat droplets dropping from the end of my chin. I can tell you when I tell you it's 100 degrees, you might go, hot. But when you're imagining little droplets of sweat falling off of someone's chin, you're starting to feel how hot and sweaty it is. Now, is it as believable to think of it so hot that sweat's just flowing off your chin? Maybe not. But it's definitely more engaging, which means you'll be drawn in to the story more, and you will be more likely to remember that description. This is a balance that you should think of in every story. Generally speaking, you don't want to convolute what you're saying. So don't use a bunch of extraneous description or more than you really need to, or something that's so outlandish that it couldn't be believed. However, don't just go and get straight to the point. Otherwise, you're not really using a story. It's just like a page, a fact book, a couple bullet points. And we know that that kind of stuff doesn't engage people. You're using stories because you want to engage people. So do leverage a lot of that imagery and a lot of those literary devices that you see in good writing and storytelling already to draw your audience in a more powerful way. I was standing on the subway train in Singapore. Over yonder, I spied an accessible seat which had a teenager sitting in it. He had his smartphone in his hand, his earphones in, and he was pretending to sleep. This being a common technique that people use who don't want to give up their seat on the train. In walks in, painfully lumbering like a giant, a very pregnant woman. She walks up to the teenager in the accessible seat. She sucks it in a little bit. Pop! Right in the face. That's what you get for sitting and pretending to sleep in the accessible seat. So what's going on here? If I would have told the story in a more straightforward, literal way, probably at the point where the lady walks up, she would silently stare at him or glare at him until hopefully he would give up the seat. But that doesn't make for a very engaging story, does it? And it probably would make it less likely for you to take away any special point from that story. It'd be like, why are you describing your ride on the subway to me? However, when I have the part where the boy gets popped in the face, well, now the point is a little bit more powerful. It kind of pops you in the face. That's where the balanced believability comes into play. Don't just tell your stories completely literal, but preserve the message and deliver it in a high impact way. Use idioms, use colorful language, use imagery, use metaphors, use analogies, use anything that you have at your disposal from the literary world to make it happen. There you have the 5 evidence-based principles of storytelling. Simulated experience, simulated empathy, authentic representation, narrative learning, balanced believability. Use clear language and vivid imagery throughout these principles as a way to design stories that are going to give your audience a genuine experience, empower them, and transform them. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my book, The Power of Storytelling. There you'll get a whole workbook on how to craft your own stories using these principles. You can always get in touch with me, and I'll help you through a coaching process to make better stories that you can use to inspire, engage, and transform the lives of others.